You all know this guy right here, Lucas Keeler. He is a blessing.
Yes.
Thought I should that. He is our local resource. Whenever we have a question, we call Lucas. He is a great historian and a researcher. And we'd like to welcome Lucas Keeler.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Lucas, you're gonna have to turn her up.
How's that?
Better. A little more.
Is that any better? How's that?
That's good.
Everybody other than Bernie okay? Shirley, you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Go with her word then. So, okay, well, this is a story of Hank Mason and the bear. It's kind of turned into a forgotten story, I think. I'm 48 and kind of got the tail end of what I thought was the local history on this event from the 1800s. I know a lot of the older residents here grew up with the story and knew it fairly well, but again, the last decade or two, it's kind of gone under the covers, I guess. And so one of the purpose of what I set out to do in writing a book about this event and others in northeastern Wyoming was to put together all the facts that I could find regarding Hank Mason and the bear. And fortunately, I found a slew of information that I don't think anybody had ever been aware of until now. So it's pretty exciting to share Hank's story with everybody. So about 1988, Mabel Brown put me onto the story of Hank Mason and the bear. I had a project in 4th grade for gifted and talented kind of class where I had to put together a history event, and so Mabel helped me choose Hank Mason. So kind of got going in 1988 on that. In 1990, I picked it up again in 6th grade in John Dom's history class, and after that, it went about 30 years in a box until in 2020 I decided I would resurrect the story. Went through some of my old material that I had researched with people like Paulette Thompson's help when Paulette was just getting started essentially in the 80s. And my clicker quick.
Technology's great, but it works.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, so first off, I guess some disclaimers on the book. I have 2 copies up front, a hardback and a paperback. They are available for sale on Amazon. I would encourage everybody in the Newcastle and Weston County area to purchase it locally if they can, and that's going to cut down on the cost, so it will be cheaper purchasing it in town. And also it's going to be about 2 weeks out before books are available. I kind of fought through some issues on the cover, and editing a fairly large size book is a lot more work than I thought it would be to get it where I wanted it to be. So I'm at the point where I was ready to publish it, so it is published. But again, we need a couple weeks before you all can buy it. But at the end of the presentation, you can look through the couple books that I do have as the proofs. Okay, so one thing with this presentation I wanted to try to avoid was giving away all the specifics from the book. Okay, so fortunately I have a lot of material that I didn't put in the book. A lot of it was photographs and just some information that I thought was interesting, but maybe wasn't that relevant to what I wanted to do in the book. So I'm kind of going to go through those today, tell the story of Hank Mason and the bear, and hopefully when the book's available, it'll make you want to buy one, or at least go to the library and check it out. So with that being said, kind of covered some of this, but there used to be a historical marker by the LAK ranch before you go down Stockade, Beaver Creek. And that sign said, "Between Beaver Creek and Canyon Springs Station, in a deep canyon lies the grave of an old buffalo hunter. The headstone reads, Hank Mason killed by a bear, 1893. So that was right on Highway 16, and anybody such as myself that had to have your parents stop at any historical marker sign in the state, you stopped here and you read that. So who wouldn't be fascinated with a historical marker that ends with that? So that kind of what led to myself, and I think a lot of local residents, to take some interest in Hank Mason, to learn about who the man was. In 1959, a man named Frank Fawcett published a story in the Newsletter Journal about Hank Mason and the bear. So between the events of 1893, when Mason was attacked by the bear, in 1959, the story of Mason was largely forgotten or not printed out in newspapers or books along that lines until Fawcett told his account of the story. He was 10 years old in 1893. I don't know how many in the audience knew Frank Fawcett. So there's 3 Frank Fawcett's at one time. Mary Capps' dad was Frank Fawcett, but not this Frank Fawcett. Okay, so this Frank Fawcett died in 1979. Okay, so Big Frank, I think he was referred to as. So Big Frank was the caretaker of the Hank Mason story. So 1959, he published this story in the Newsletter Journal talking about when he was 10 years old, and his dad, Frank, was also Frank's, so Frank B. Fawcett's account, so it was passed down to his son, and Frank Jr. retold the story in the Newsletter Journal. So this story was what most people were familiar with when they heard of the Hank Mason story, was a result of Frank Fawcett's retelling of it in 1959. So I started out with this article by Frank and the historical marker on Beaver Creek.
Is it still there?
We'll get into that, but okay. This is a little blurry to see, but this was taken in 1988. So there's Casey, there's Mom, there's Mabel, and there's me. Okay, so Mabel took us down to Hank's grave in 88 so I could get a photo. Dad took this photo of us. Okay, so that was part of my initial 1988 project. Okay, I think this one was 1990. So this was in the basement of the Anna Miller Museum. This is a wrought iron fence. This was around Hank Mason's grave. It was up at Stockade Beaver Creek for a number of years until it was removed, and is currently still in the library. But Mabel and I dug through the museum until we found this chain, because I had to have a picture of Hank's chain around his grave for my story. Okay, so this is 1990. I can tell by the Wyoming Centennial cap, so this was freshly embroidered. And so this was my 6th grade history project on Hank. Okay, so that's essentially what I had in place until 2020, before I decided I would find Hank. Fortunately, I got lucky on a few fronts on some of my research. I went on to what's called findagrave.com, so about anybody that's died, with any luck, you've got some kind of memorial on there. So I looked up Hank Mason, and sure enough, somebody had built a page for him. Okay, and then on Hank's page, there was his parents. So that in itself, his parents' name was Ruth Eliza Mason and Henry Mason. So Hank Mason was Henry Mason II. So with that in hand, I was able to look through some early U.S. Census reports, and I got the county down to Rensselaer County, New York. Okay, so this is Troy, New York is the county seat of Rensselaer. Okay, so I traced the Hank and the Mason family to right where I put this bear. Okay, these are out in this portion of New York. So the town was Postingkill, New York, but Postingkill itself was a village like 20 miles by 10 miles in size. Okay, so although all these little towns you see here were part of Postingkill. Postingkill, the village, the main city proper was right in here. So the Mason family lived about 20 miles north of the town of Postingkill. Okay, so this is Henry Mason the First. He was born in 1800 in New York. Was a farmer. Purchased his farm in Rensselaer County in 1830, and from 1830 he and his wife. This is Eliza. So this is Hank Mason's mom. So they raised the Mason family on their family farm. Okay, so this is the town of Postingkill in 1860s. You can see on that map. I don't know if it was the size of Weston County or so, but how towns were set up out there. There were just really no city limits per se. But using this 1860 map of Postingkill, New York, I was able to find the Henry Mason Ranch or farm. Okay, located right here. Okay, so fortunately I got on Google Earth to look at the Hank Mason's farm, and this is it. Okay, so the address is like 333 North Road in Rensselaer County, New York. Okay, so this is an 1830 house built by Henry Mason. So this is where Hank Mason and his siblings grew up in. It's still standing to this day. And this was an early 1800s barn constructed on the same property. So it's pretty cool. I tried to do some title search and reach out to the landowner to get some more photos of the house and all that kind of stuff. I haven't had any luck getting hold of anybody in New York that would really help me on this project. So it's kind of at a standstill until I can find out more of this house. But this is the Henry Mason home. Okay, so Hank Mason was born probably June or July of 1850 in Rensselaer County. U.S. Census reports from 1850 for the Mason family from July of that year mentioned a 2-month-old baby named Henry. So 2 months from the end of the July census report puts his birthday around May or June, probably in there. So we can assume that Mason was born May or June of 1850. By 1860, Hank Mason was still on the census report for the Mason family, 10 years old. He did go to school, was literate, could read. However, 1865, the state of New York did a population report. So unlike the U.S. Census, some states themselves do a census report. And with the end of the Civil War, I think states were kind of doing an inventory of who they had lost and what their state's population looked like. So 1865, the farm of Henry Mason had every family member there except one boy, Hank Mason. Okay, so by 1865, 15-year-old Hank Mason appears to have left New York and decided to go west. So I had an idea from earlier accounts of Mason that he went to California sometime in the California Gold Rush days, so 1860s to early 1870s. Mason was supposedly in California mining and hunting, but I did some substantial research in California records, and there's no account of him in California. So that's one of two kind of dead ends in all my research that I hit that kind of bummed about, because I really thought I could find some good stories in California, and they just were not there. But with these gold rushes in California, there was thousands, if not millions, of people went out there to look for gold. And you could easily, as a 20-year-old, get lost in the rush, I assume. So obviously didn't find much success. I did think I've got him tracked down to Nevada County, California. So that's a theory based upon a couple things that I'll talk about later, but this is against the Nevada state line. So I suspect that's where Mason was.
In addition to the weekly printed version of the newsletter journal, we also promote our community and share important information on our award-winning website, newslj.com, and in our weekly email newsletter, Nuke Now. We also connect with readers through various social media platforms and invite you to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can even take a look at a recent meeting of the City Council, School Board, or County Commission on our YouTube channel. We do hope that you will go to newslj.com and subscribe today, and we look forward to making all of our great content available to you. But regardless of your level of support, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for doing your part to preserve a free and independent local press.
This is against the Nevada state line, so I suspect that's where Mason was. But Hank Mason's whereabouts were not known for certain until 1876. Okay, so what happened in 1876 in the Black Hills that seemed to bring half the country to the Black Hills, and that was gold and deadwood. Okay, so 1876, Mason came to the Black Hills to search for gold. This is a photo. It's from Wyoming or westernmininghistory.com website. So this is an 1876 photo of what deadwood looked like during the initial boom. I don't know how many of you have seen some of these early photos, but they're pretty crazy that this is what deadwood looked like,
Wow.
what we know it today.
Jesus,
So,
and it's
there was a couple of early fires in Deadwood, I think maybe 1879 or 1881, somewhere in there, that essentially burned all these structures that you see in these early photographs. So when you read or we talk about Hank Mason in the Black Hills in the 1870s, this is the kind of rat race that he was working through. So upon coming to the Black Hills, he started looking for gold. Reports were that he struck out, which is what most of the gold seekers that came to the Black Hills did. They all dreamed about getting rich, and very few did. So he had to have a fallback plan. And that plan was to become a hunter to supply the mining camps in Deadwood with venison or bison meat. So at that point, he needed a partner in his endeavors, and he found a man from Wisconsin named George Maddox. So Maddox and his wife came out to the Black Hills from Wisconsin to look for gold, and they too didn't strike it rich. So Maddox was a hunter in the Midwest and found Mason as his hunting partner. They hunted bison and venison for a couple of years, supplying the Black Hills with some meat. They eventually parted ways, probably in 1878 or so. The Maddoxes went up to the Medora, North Dakota, in that area. So Maddox, I have a whole chapter devoted to what I found on him, but he and his wife were really good with leather making, and they could make buckskin jackets and pants and all that. And so their place in Medora, one evening, young wannabe rancher named Teddy Roosevelt came to their dugout and saw some of the work that Maddox's did with leather working. And so Teddy Roosevelt ordered a jacket from George Maddox. This is an iconic photo of Teddy Roosevelt, and this jacket was one that was made by George Maddox. So Hank Mason's former hunting partner made this for Teddy Roosevelt. So that's pretty cool. And there's okay, and in one of the visitor centers at Medora and Teddy Roosevelt National park is this wooden statue of Roosevelt wearing some more buckskin. Okay, and this was also made by George Maddox. So the visitor center up in Medora has, it has it given to them by G. Maddox. So it's pretty cool. There is some provenance on this buckskin coming from Maddox to Teddy Roosevelt to the museum. So.
That fits.
So after the departure of Maddox and Mason from hunting, Hank had to find somewhere else to hunt, and he came to the Jenny Stockade, LAK area. Okay, so probably 1878, 1879, Mason found his way to the vicinity of what's the EVA Ranch. This is an 1880 U.S. Census. So this is the first official record that I was found of Mason's existence between the 1860 census and 1880. It's a little tough to read, but there are 9 separate dwellings on this census. They refer to Stockade Beaver Creek in the LAK as the Lower Beaver River of Laramie County Census Report. So up until this time, Laramie County stretched from Cheyenne all the way up to the Montana line. So it was one county. Then it became Crook County after this before becoming Weston. But at the time of this census, it was Laramie County, and the Lower Beaver River was the area. Again, nine dwellings in here. One name in particular, the Hank Friel family. So Friels go back to Weston County for a long time, and this is the first Friel that came to Weston County. I've got a whole chapter in the book devoted to the Friels. Another family of note is Ben Eager. So Eager was he was a Hereford rancher, kind of in the vicinity of the EVA ranch too. So he was the furthest north up that section of Stockade Beaver Creek. And then dwelling number 9, we have Henry Mason listed as a hunter and trapper. Place of birth, New York. Father's birthplace, New York. Mom's birthplace, New Hampshire. So that's kind of how I tracked Mason to what is now Weston County. Okay, so Mason's hunting cabin that he had, just based upon that census, would have been in the vicinity of the EVA. The location is not known, but
Painted.
appears to be just up Beaver Creek from the Eager Ranch at the EVA. So kind of picture that as where Mason's cabin was when he came to this area of the Black Hills to go hunting. So 1880, after that census was taken, the Ben Eager family relocated their Hereford Ranch from Stockade Beaver Creek and went to Indian Care where Eagers established a ranch. Also accompanying the Eagers was Hank Mason. So Mason left Stockade Beaver Creek for the time being and went to Indian Cara, worked for this Ben Eager, and also Mason ended up at some point getting his own homestead, and we'll talk about that later.
Of course, I would notice this, but I find this picture very interesting, and I saw it earlier on another picture that you had. That backdrop is a painted backdrop that this photographer, he had quite an elaborate for that day setup where he could pose these people, and you even can see the grass is just chunks, artificial squares of stuff that he's got them posed on. And I think that's really interesting, and when you look at the history of photography, and these people, they'd have to keep that pose for quite a while because they did not have fast shutter speeds and all that stuff for it. Yeah. But I found that in itself fascinating in the history of this.
No, for sure. 1880, Mason left Stockade Beaver Creek and went to the Belle Fourche River. So outside of Moorcroft, Gillette area was where Hank went after leaving Stockade Beaver Creek. Okay, and at that point, he got involved with the buffalo hunting. So buffalo were still fairly
Fascinating picture.
huge herds of them still at this time in northeastern Wyoming in 1880. So Mason, like many others, began hunting buffalo and had some hide guys with them that would strip the hides off of these buffalo and all that. So that's what Mason was doing in 1880 when he went to the Belle Fourche River area. And at that point, he met a young rancher named Bartlett Richards.
Which one's Mason?
No photos of Mason exist,
Ah,
so we're gonna have to just close our eyes and picture what he looks like. So that's maybe problem number 3 of all the work I've done on this. There's no photos of it. Okay, so with that being said, this guy here is Bartlett Richards. I don't know if any of you have heard of Bartlett Richards, but his brother was a governor of Wyoming, DeForest Richards. Okay, so this is DeForest's little brother, Bartlett. And Bartlett established a ship wheel ranch outside of Moorcroft. I don't know who's all heard of the ship wheel, still in existence to this day. But Bartlett was a rich kid from out east. He wanted to come out west, so he got involved with all the big shot cattlemen in Cheyenne. I suspect that's where this photo was taken, was when he was hustling money to buy a herd of cattle. So Richards, as 18 years old, got some money in Cheyenne and came up to the Moorcroft area where he established a ship wheel. Also at this time, he was looking for professional hunters with some varmint control and that sort of thing. Wolves were still prominent, bears, coyotes, all that sort of a thing. So he recruited a lot of hunters during this point to do predator control for the ship wheel, one of which was Hank Mason. And Richards is a real interesting read. I was going to designate more in the book than I have, but he turned out to be the king of the sandhills. So he had a huge ranch in Nebraska. He got in the doghouse with Teddy Roosevelt on illegally fencing federal lands, and so Richards made a name for himself as probably being having the largest ranch holdings in the U.S. at one point, and pretty important guy in the livestock industry. So around 1880, he hired Hank. This photo is kind of tough. It should be clearer in the book, I'm hoping, but I found this in an issue. It was called Recreation Magazine. It's from 1899, and a guy submitted a photo and a story talking about this muley head. Okay, so this was taken by Mason in the winter of 1880, 1881, probably around Devil's Tower, somewhere in the Bear Lodge is all that he said. It had 44 distinguished points on that. Okay, and I just counting on this front, you can count 20 some. And, looking at it from the back, in theory, you could pick up 20 more points. So the writer of the article who had this photo talked that, as far as anybody knew, it was the largest head in the world outside of a club in London, supposedly had one with more points. Okay, I figured something of that size and magnitude had to be still in existence. So I checked with Boone and Crockett. Bartlett Richards purchased this and took it to Nebraska with him when he ran the bank in Chadron. No records of this thing in Chadron. Richards' house mansion eventually did burn down in the early 1900s, and I'm kind of thinking that might have been lost in that house, because just again can't see how that would have gotten lost very easily. Even the taxidermy skills at that time were obviously not very good for mounting a bear and those kind of animals, but just the horns like that could have a pretty poor taxidermist, and that should still survive unless it did get burned. So that is lost, but that is credited to Mason's hunting in the winter of 1880.
wow.
Okay, so around this time, 1882, buffalo hunting went really well. It was a fall winter job. The buffalo would come down from southern Canada, northern Montana to the plains of Wyoming. Hunters would come in here and shoot the buffalo. Spring of 1883, everything was fine and dandy for the buffalo hunters. They were expecting to come back in the fall and do all that, and the buffalo did not come. They were almost never seen again. So Hank had to find something else to do. So he went to Indian Cara. Here's Ben Eager's ranch that we talked about earlier. Okay, so down Indian Cara Creek, this is the Upton to Sundance Highway. Mason applied for a homestead, this red one, and he also applied for 160 Timber Culture Act, they're called, so you had to plant some trees over a 5-year period in order to get the land. And that was the blue was Mason's Timber Culture Act. I go into more details in the book about the definitions of these different homestead acts. Okay, so in 1885, Mason officially applied for his homestead on Indian Cara Creek. This is the receipt that you get for when you applied for a homestead. So this was applied by Mason officially December 25th, 1885. Some of the details on the land, the legal location. Kind of harder to see here too, but this is the Timber Culture Act application that he put into, again, for 160 acres. Typically, you put 5 under like cottonwood for cottonwoods. You plant some trees, hope they take, and if a government official came and inspected it, they see you had some trees growing where there was no trees beforehand, and then you would get the land. Around this same time, Mason applied for us to get his brand registered with Wyoming Territory. And this I found out at State Archives in Cheyenne of his brand record from 1885 with his brand. Kind of hard to see here, but it was a plus and an equals mark was Mason's brand for horses and oxen. So one thing to come about on Mason's wandering around hunting buffalo and deer and all that kind of thing, he was kind of one of the end of the mountain men, frontiersmen, however you want to put it. But this was his primary focus. Here's about where Moorcroft is. Keyhole's right here. But this was his primary focus. Here's about where Moorcroft is. Keyhole's right here. Belfouche River goes up this way. Oshoto is probably about right in here. Little Missouri River goes up here. So all of Mason's messing around looking for something to hunt. He stumbled across oil in 1885. So as far as I'm able to tell, it's the first record of what is now Crook County of oil being discovered, and it was done by Mason. So along the Belfouche here, I suspect these are all separate claims Mason had for oil placer claims. I think it was this one here. Mason stumbled across an oil spring. So that's how a lot of these oil plays were discovered. You find a spring, water would come out of a formation, and then it'd have oil in it. So they would skim the oil out of the water of the spring, and that was how oil wells were produced during that time. So Mason found a spring, dubbed it Mason Springs, and skimmed off barrels of oil out of his spring. He would take them to Sundance, and eventually it would go to Deadwood. So Homestake needed a lot of oil to lube the gold mine equipment. Okay, and the oil around this play that Mason had, and then a bigger and older play was around where the Handev oil well is, Jenny Stockade, LAK, that area. So I go into that oil play more in the book because it was huge in the establishment of early Newcastle, which most people don't think that there was that much going on prior to the railroad coming in, but there was a lot of activity going on. So that's where Mason probably got his toes dipped in the oil industry, was around the LAK and that oil play. But by 1885, Homestake was still needing a good lube for equipment. This oil around what would become Newcastle and along the Belfouche was really thick stuff and great for lubrication. Before, they would bring oil in from the East Coast like Pennsylvania, and it was not a very good lubricant. It had too many light-ins in it, so it was more gassy than it was actual thick. So this oil played a huge role with Homestake in Deadwood. No oil was used for for the gold mine, other than this Black Hills oil that was coming out of these springs. So Mason got a bunch of investors together. They all rolled up their money for these 160-acre placer claims. So each guy could claim 20 acres of his own. So if you could get 8 guys pulled up together, you could have a 160-acre claim. So that's kind of what Mason did on all these, was find investors. Eventually, the springs started to dry up. They weren't having any luck actually drilling a well. So Mason abandoned his oil dreams, and instead, fall of 1886, Crook County, so Sundance was growing in population. They needed what was called a road and bridge supervisor, essentially a county employee that would be given a certain districts of the county and told, you need to fix the roads or you need to build a bridge. So sometime in 1886, Mason was appointed the first road and bridge supervisor in Crook County. 1886, they actually had an election. Sheriff Jim Ryan, he was the one always chasing the Sundance Kid. So this is when he got elected. So John L. Baird, so this was the Baird that was one of the founding fathers in Newcastle. So there are some names in here. And here's Hank Mason for road supervisor. So this is when Mason ran during the general election and got elected. He was running unopposed. So during that time, so on Indian Cara Creek, where like the old Barton Ranch was, I think Hadley's have it now, but there was a major bridge that crossed the Indian Cara Creek at that time. So Mason constructed that bridge, constructed some on Wind Creek, down at Moorcroft. So the western parts of what we know as Crook County now was Mason's territory on some of his road and bridge projects. Okay, eventually, so in 1887, a guy named Alpheus Hansen was a sawmill man outside of Sundance. So he was a rancher, and he ended up being a Wyoming state senator. But he had this sawmill 5 miles west of Sundance. He needed some logs hauled into the sawmill, of course. So they posted an advertisement in the Sundance paper saying that a team was wanting to haul logs at the Houston Creek sawmill. We'll pay cash and good wages. Well, who do you think decided he wanted to be a sawmill man? This is Alpheus A.P. Hansen. So he ended up owning the YT on Skull Creek at some point. He bought it in the early. He had it at some point in the late 1890s, I believe. But anyway, that's Hansen. So Mason got recruited to haul logs for the Houston Creek sawmill, and this was essentially his boss, Alpheus Hansen. Okay, one thing, he eventually became the Surveyor General of Wyoming in 1897. So that was kind of his profession, was a surveyor, but again, Hansen had a lot of other endeavors that he was involved with. Okay, so with Mason hauling logs for Hansen. Okay, so this is Hansen's sawmill. So this is on Indian Cara Creek, and it's called Road Creek. So Miller Creek's right in here. I think they call it Sunny Divide or so. But there's Road Creek comes off right down here where it hits Indian Cara Creek. And so this was where the Hansen sawmill was. And here's where Mason's ranch is. So he was a rancher at this time, 15 miles apart. Okay, one thing that I kind of was always under the impression when I heard that Mason was a sawmill man in Crook County, I assumed that he was taking timber off of Indian Cara and work in that area. But by this point, the millmen had already gotten to Indian Cara and Black Buttes and all that area. And so Mason never did have a sawmill around Indian Cara close to his ranch. It was actually up here working for Hansen. So eventually, Hank thought, well, I'm just going to buy this sawmill from Hansen. So he borrowed a lot of money to do so, and changed the name from Houston Creek to the Indian Cara Mills. There we have Henry Mason is the owner. So he ran a few of these newspaper articles in the Sundance paper for a while. Also at this time, Ben Eager finally put in for his homestead application at Indian Cara Creek. And the main thing I got off of this was some of the early information on Mason, and that's why I've got it displayed here. So this is Mason was the witness to Eager on his homestead application. So each homesteader had to have 3 witnesses to say how long they were on the land and some of the work that they did and all that kind of thing. So Eager used Mason, and again, interesting information is October of 1880 was how long both Mason and Eager had resided at Indian Cara. That was something I wasn't sure about on when Mason left Stockade Beaver Creek for sure. And this also was the giveaway on the whole sawmill location. You're running a sawmill about 15 miles from the homestead. Okay, and that was the ticket there that I finally learned that, yeah, the sawmill wasn't at Indian Cara, like I think was assumed, and it was actually further down Indian Cara Creek. And then right in here, he'd known Eager since 1878 on Beaver Creek. Okay, so that was what told me when Mason left Deadwood for Stockade Beaver Creek was 1878 based upon this. So these documents on a complete homestead document are only found through the National Archives on microfiche in DC. So you have to pay $50 and you request the whole packet. You have no clue what you're going to get. It may be 2 pages or it may be 100. It's just a total crapshoot. But this one actually turned out to have way more information than Mason's actual application itself did. So without Eager's homestead application, I would have been missing a lot of information. So this is asking how long Mason had been on Eager's property, and from 1880 to 1886, he had worked for the claimant on his claim. So that told me he periodically worked for Ben Eager when he wasn't hunting buffalo. Okay, and there's another cool thing that you get with these. So this is an actual, since I don't have a photo, I mean, the signature is going to be as best as I can do. So these were actually had to be signed by the witnesses and all that. So this is a Hank Mason signature. Unless you're a real nerd like me, I mean, that's pretty important, but you know, it's just kind of
cool.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so around 1889, Hank was borrowing a lot of money. The Indian Cara sawmill was going broke. He needed to relocate somewhere, running out of trees on Indian Cara Creek. He talked about Oak Creek, moving the sawmill there, and I think this is an Oak Creek that comes out of the Bear Lodge, and I think that was where he was going to move the sawmill to. But there were certain developments going on in southern Crook County in 1889. We have the Jenny Stockade LAK Ranch at that point. Tubtown Field City was right here. Black Hills Salt Company, so these are the salt mines north of the Flying V. I go into a lot of detail on all these industries in the book, the history of the salt mine, since it was discovered in 1877, which is a lot earlier than I think people realize. These are the oil placer claims that were found in the Newcastle area, stretching from about the hand-dug oil well there all the way out to the airport. So these were seeps all through this area where prospectors had cabins on. So there were cabins and houses essentially where Newcastle is all the way to the LAK, 1877 or so, which is kind of predates what most of us believe the history of Newcastle was. So here's our area where the oil industry was trying to boom. And here is Newcastle. So September of 1889, the town was established. They were short on lumber, a lot of people coming in. And so Hank Mason thought, by golly, there's a new town and they need some lumber. So I'm the man for the job. So Mason upped and moved his sawmill from on Indian Carrot Creek. So these sawmills were huge, but some were defined as portable, which portable doesn't mean you just hook it onto a ball on a wagon or something and pull it. So these portable ones took days or weeks to move because, yeah, they could be moved, but they were no fun to move. So Mason moved his sawmill equipment from Indian Cara to Stockade Beaver Creek. So established his sawmill and had some jobs in Newcastle to supply lumber. One of the interesting things I found on Mason was there was a lot of stories about him in the early Sundance papers. So you could find a whole bunch of information on him, on what he was doing, the bridges he built, building fence and all that. So there was a lot of information, but upon moving to Newcastle, it vanished. There's very little information on Mason once he came down to Newcastle. So around where the sawmill was set up on Stockade Beaver Creek, I was out with Dick and Bernie one day. So this is remnants of a tree. So I don't know, 30 some inches probably, maybe diameter. Okay, and so on this tree, you can see this was all cut down with an axe. Okay, so these are cuts low to the ground, all axe cut, and this is a huge ponderosa. Okay, so that typically that kind of axe work and all that was 1800s. So, and more, it's probably pretty certain that this was a remnant of a tree that Mason cut down with an axe when he had his sawmill set up on this area of Stockade Beaver Creek. So there is still remnants of Hank Mason to be found if you follow his trail, which is still pretty cool considering it's been over 130 years now. But anyway, that's a tree on the old Mason homestead on Stockade Beaver Creek. So he did apply for a 160-acre claim on Beaver Creek, got his sawmill set up there, and tried to stay busy with jobs building early Newcastle. So there was a livery service kind of a barn right behind the antlers. So where one of those houses is across from the Methodist church, there was a livery station that sold lumber, and that lumber sold there on that lot with some of Mason's boards from Stockade Beaver Creek. So Bailey and Shevling had the name of this livery station. They offered feed and stable, and they also supplied lumber. So Bailey and Shevling had the name of this livery station. They offered feed and stable, and they also supplied lumber. So in 1890, Mason decided, well, he was tired of supplying his lumber to Bailey and Shevling, so he bought Bailey out. So half interest in this business, again, right behind the antlers, because there was a lot of kind of lumber yards there and livery services and that. And so that was the area where Mason and Shevling operated, and he sold his lumber out of. This is an 1890 Sanborn fire map, they call them. So early towns, I found one of these on Cambria, and so it's pretty cool. It has a lot of the old buildings listed from 1890 in Newcastle. This is a little tricky to see, but this was a lumber yard that Kilpatrick and Brothers and Collins had. The KB&C had some lumber stacked here. Antlers was right here, but at this time it was the commissary that was there before the hotel was put in. And see, this says livery. So this lot here, lot number 4, was where Mason's business was in town. These are available through the Library of Congress website, so you could, it has about 10 maybe early Newcastle these fire maps, so you can almost track businesses on these. And it's kind of neat. You can see a Chinese laundromat where Isabella's is, and just various things. So these are super cool, and they're a lot easier to read on the website. So
Lucas, are these pictures like this right here, is it in your book?
this one's not. And so that, again, that goes back to what I want to divulge now. And not try to spoil it too much. I do talk about this. I was worried about how this was going to print in the book, so I didn't include the Sanborn map and all that. So that's kind of why I'm showing it here, because it is real neat, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it in the book. But okay, so around Christmas of 1890, Hank was broke again. Okay, so he took out what were called chattel mortgages. So that was pretty common at the time. So what a chattel would be is, I've got 5 oxen. Jan Frella is going to loan me $150. Okay, and if I don't pay back within 6 months on my ranch, Jan could go get those 6 oxen. Okay, I could still keep my oxen, so it wasn't a collateral deal where like you took possession of them like a pawn shop type of deal. I still got to work my land and haul logs with the oxen. But in the event I couldn't pay Jan back, she'd come get my oxen. So of all my research, this is one of the cooler things that I found. So I was in Cheyenne digging through early Weston County records at the state archives, and so I went through this chattel mortgage section. And interestingly enough, December of 1890, Mason borrowed some money from a guy named T.J. Wagner. So this is Thomas Jefferson Wagner, or Tom Wagner. I have about a 30-page chapter in the book designated towards Wagner and this whole thing with loan and Mason money and all that. So this is a rather famous individual. If you don't know who Tom Wagner is, he's going to be coming up in 2 books from now. But he is covered in my book, but it's quite a story. So Colleen Paulette wrote a book called Secrets. It covered some of the Wagner story, but not as much as I've found, and so I'm pretty excited about that book too. But the Tom Wagner part of the chapter began with me finding this down at the state archives on, these are the names of all the Mason's ox that he used as collateral. So he has one named Red, Bob,
Jimmy,
Jimmy, a roan ox called Smith.
all these.
Smith.
So anyway, he had all his ox named. They were about 6 years old. Okay, so I talked to Sue Kelly, who talked to Dean about it, so I had to figure out what the heck an ox was. I mean, you think you know, but I really didn't, and it's kind of just a steer that doesn't get turned into hamburger and gets old. So these were probably some kind of just a tip, I don't know if it was some kind of cross on a cow, but that cow gets trained as a calf to pull plows and hook them to logs, to drag logs around, that kind of thing. So when the ox gets like 5 or 6 years old, it turns into an oxen if it lives that long. So these oxen were old steers, and they were trained to haul lumber, wagons, and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's what Mason used to give to Wagner. Okay, and this is a picture of Tom Wagner. So the Wagner Horse Ranch was, I think it's the Saunders Ranch now, so it's south of Upton on Lodgepole Creek. Okay, so I did find a few of these chattel mortgages that Mason was borrowing money from. He did a lot of double borrowing. So those oxen, yeah, they could be Wagner's, but he also had them figured into somebody else's loan. So he better hope at least one of them gets paid, because if he neglects to pay both of them, they're going to kind of have a problem on who gets old Red and. So I assume that the lumber business wasn't great in Newcastle by about 1891 or so. There was other competitors like Tom Sweet. Davis and Hanson had a sawmill on Stockade too. Kilpatrick Brothers and Collins had their sawmill that worked Cambria Canyon. So I think he got, just like his past has shown, he kind of got bored with doing the sawmill thing, was going broke, so he wanted to get back in the gold game. So in 1891, reports were that gold was discovered on Stockade Beaver Creek, probably in the vicinity of Mallow or below Mallow. So Mason, he staked some placer gold claims all along Stockade Beaver Creek. These are all in Pennington County. And this is the EVA ranch in here, so bunch of gold claims, Mason and a bunch of other investors.
So is that the South Dakota line there in
Yep,
near
this
the
is South
middle?
Dakota here.
Okay.
Okay, so this was Mason's 1891 and 1892 gold endeavors. A lot of investors got in. This is Bear Run, kind of by the EVA. So they did a lot of hard rock mining here where they were tunneling and all that, looking for quartz. So big gold plays right in here, underground mining though. These were all placer claims that they would have sluice boxes and all that and try to work the gravels of Beaver Creek. Okay, so that kept Mason busy for a couple years. This is Bear Canyon. They had 4 gold claims up Bear Canyon. One of these was called the Pittsburgh, and another one was called the Glendale. So I did some research on these two claims. Well, I thought Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then Glendale, and maybe Southern California or somewhere like that. So this Nevada County, California that I was talking about, 2 of the famous gold mines that would have been around when Mason was in California was the Pittsburgh and the Glendale. So that's kind of my guess is where Mason was in California was based upon how he came up with these names that were reflective of Nevada County, California. Barb?
Is there anything left of the underground mine there, Bear Run?
I don't know, and I've got it in a book, but Cheyenne newspaper came up and wrote about it and mentioned there's a 50-foot shaft, so they had tunneled 50 foot in somewhere on Beaver Creek, and they found silver and gold, and they took it to a sayer, and that's kind of where it went there. So I think, and it's another can of worms, but how much gold can you possibly find in this limestone? And these guys got excited and said they found gold, and you get up there now, you're not gonna find any quartz so I think they were looking for, cracks in the ground literally where maybe some kind of gold, some kind of quartz came up and maybe brought some gold with it, so the book has a couple chapters on the gold and the research that I did on that, but these gold claims were filed in Pennington County and Weston County. Okay, so up Bear Canyon on Mason's Pittsburgh claim, he built a cabin. Okay, this is what's left of Mason's gold mine cabin up Bear Canyon. So it's about, you can kind of see on the corner right here. So it's about 4 logs high. This log right here was one of the beams, probably for the roof. So a lot like what he would have had as a buffalo hunter. So buffalo hunters used a kind of a dugout principle where they would dig down a little ways into the ground and then they would only have to build a yay high tall wall versus a full cabin. So this is on the side of a hill, so likely it was more of a dugout with a few logs up this high.
Wow.
Okay, so this was, Ron Berdall pointed this out to me when he took me up Bear Canyon once, so it's pretty cool to know that Mason constructed this and that you can still see some of it.
Did he have a family at that time?
Not yet,
Why did he?
we'll get to her. Okay, so this side here is where the logs were that we just saw, and this is probably one of the beams it went across. You can see that's some pretty rough, he didn't really work those logs a lot, because they're not pretty, they were pretty makeshift, but. Okay, the opposite corner of that cabin is a lot of rock work done. So this is a rock bottom and then a rock side. So this, I suspect, is likely where he had some form of a stove set there. So he would have had to probably have some heat. You wouldn't want to set it on the ground. So I assume that's why this was more insulated with the rocks than the rest of the cabin. There doesn't appear to be that many rocks.
Why wouldn't you put it on the ground?
I just think it would have been a floor, a rock, something to set, if he had a barrel or whatever used as a fireplace or a salamander, just, it was probably, I'm sure it was leveler than that. But, it'd been some kind of a rock base, so he didn't probably burn the place down, I would assume. So that cabin is deteriorating quickly. It's on U.S. Forest Service property, so it is accessible coming in through South Dakota and the limestone. But a few years, as you can see, that cabin is going to be gone. So Hank and Hannah.
Oh, yeah, there she is.
So sometime, I assume in 1892, 40-some-year-old bachelor. That's another thing to keep in mind during these events. Mason was way younger than I am. I mean, you hear the story, you think he was like some older guy, but he was about 40 years old, so had a lot of miles on him, but still, that's not as old as I always assumed he would be. So 1892, he fell in love, or something along that line, with a lady that lived down Stockade Beaver Creek. Okay, so this is where the Nichols Ranch is right here. Okay, Davis Place, you're right in here. So on the back side of so Nichols property now, but towards the west, there was 160 acres of land, and a gal named Hannah Cameron homesteaded this land in the 1880s and lived there all alone. This blue was a friend of hers named Joe Allison. I talked about Joe in the book. He played a prominent role in Hannah's story and Hank's. So I do have quite a few chapters devoted to the research on Hannah. She was always kind of a mystery. When you hear the Hank Mason story, it's always Mrs. Mason. Okay, Mrs. Mason did this and Mrs. Mason did that. So she was extremely mysterious, but I did pretty much crack her, other than the tail end is the second big letdown. Besides Hank's California years, it was the end of Hannah. But so anyway, Hannah lived here all alone. Allison here. Mason lived up Stockade. So 2 days before Thanksgiving of 1892, Hank and Hannah decided to get hitched. Okay, so this top is the marriage license that they got in town. And that's on November 24th. And on November 26th, so Thanksgiving Day, 1892, they got married in Newcastle by the Episcopal Church Reverend named Lutton. Okay, so Lutton performed the ceremony. Hank was put as 50 years old, and Hannah was rounded down to 40. So 1892, with a birth date of 1850, Hank was 42 years old. And this says he's 50. Hannah was born 1852, 1853 in there, so she would have been probably 38 or 39 at the time. But anyway, so this is a record too that I did find when I was in 4th grade, and it got from Paulette at the courthouse at the time. So this was the other little bit of information that I had going into this whole research process, was this marriage license. So even though she's referred to as Anna here, I assume that was Anna Hannah. They just dropped that H. It is Hannah Cameron.
The new store. This is the one-stop shop. We have a pharmacy. We have a bootlegger's liquor. The deli, the food that you can get at a lunchtime is so amazing. The coffee shop. Certain Friday mornings, there's 30 people sitting here in all these chairs. This is the hub for people to come and visit, have their coffee, have their donuts. It's amazing what this area has done. Totally amazing.
Okay, so 1893, things were happening on Stockade Beaver Creek. Bear had been coming in, killing horses and cattle for the last few years. Big grizzly bear by all accounts. A lot of the local ranchers on Stockade Beaver Creek went hunting this bear, including Hank. Okay, they had no luck. Fall of 1892, probably around the time of the marriage, the bear, of course, went hibernating. No indications of it until May 18th, 19th of 1893. So there was a snow that night on Stockade Beaver Creek. As the story goes, Mason opened his door on the morning of May 19th, 1893, and by golly, there was 3 inches of snow on his step. And what did he see in the snow? We saw some grizzly bear tracks about the size of dinner plates.
Oh my gosh.
So this thing was a monster. Mason the previous year had tried to bait the bear using a dead horse. So he dragged the horse to the edge of one of his pastures, and he set up a stand in the trees where he waited and waited to try to bait that bear in off of that dead horse, but no luck. Okay, horse carcass was still there in 1893, thawing out. Bear came on the steps, went and ate on that horse, and then decided he would go back up into the limestone country of Pennington County. So Mason told Hannah, he said, that bear's mine, but I'm going to go get some bacon out of the cabin or some meat that was hanging up in there. So I'm going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, get that bear, and get some grub out of the refrigerator, essentially, that was that mining cabin up Bear Canyon. So Mason tracked that bear a couple miles till he got into Pennington County. So this is the Pittsburgh claim. He had one called the Red Ledger, I think was this one, the Glendale, and then there was another one. So here's his 4 mining claims in Bear Canyon. And he tracked the bear right by his cabin, decided he'd stop and get the food after he took care of the bear. Went up here, saw a sleeping bear underneath a tree. So thought, well, now's his time to shoot it. Bear was obstructed with some branches of a spruce tree. Hank shot all of his life, thought, well, I'll just most likely just try to shoot it in the shoulder, break its shoulder and break the bear down and then get off a second shot. So he shot the bear, hit it in the shoulder, or so he thought. Well, the bear got mad. He didn't have a broken shoulder and wasn't broke down and all that like the plan was. Bear was mad, started getting up, and Hank decided, high time he better get another shell loaded. So he was shooting a Model 1876 Winchester as a .40-60 caliber. Okay, so Mason hand loaded these shells. It had probably held like 12 shots or so in the magazine, I guess, so they were already in there. He didn't have to fish shells out of his pocket and feed them in, so they were in the magazine. So all he had to do was, cock the lever in theory and would bring the shell in there to shoot. Well, the gun jammed. The bear was even madder, and the bear charged him. So 50 yards from the bear mad, he had no gun at that point. He saw a nearby aspen tree and headed for that aspen tree, tried to get up that thing and get out of the bear's reach. So he almost got up, but it was a fairly small aspen tree, and that aspen tree wasn't meant to hold an adult in. So bear got Hank by the heel, ripped his heel off, grabbed him by the leg, eventually drug him to the ground, where the first fight ensued. Mason had a pocket knife on him and tried to fight off the bear with the pocket knife and the rocks, grabbing nearby rocks to try to beat it, gouge its eyes out, that kind of thing, but no luck there. Eventually lost consciousness, so the signs indicate. The bear left to go get a drink. Hank woke up. Okay, so right here's our cabin. Probable attack site was some aspen east of the cabin. Okay, so Hank regained some senses. His lower body was with that heel. He tried to wrap it, stop some of the bleeding on his other wounds, and started trying to walk the 2+ miles out of Bear Canyon back to his home. Here's his mining cabin, which in most cases would be a pretty good place to hide up, and if you lock the door and all that, you'd keep a bear out. Well, the thing didn't have a door. Supposedly lost the door. So a cabin without a door is pretty much your sitting duck, and it's a death trap. So he didn't have a cabin to go to, so he kept crawling out of Bear Canyon until he got to this point. The bear had gone back to the first attack site, looking for his prey, and then finding no guy there, he ended up tracking Mason, and where Hank had been crawling out, and found him right here. So at that point, the bear literally destroyed Hank, grabbed him by his lower jaw, and just literally ripped the bottom of his face off, and ate his ribs out, and started eating on him literally. Bear got tired of that. Hank was dead at that point, late morning of May 19th, 1893. So back at the cabin, Hannah was told by Hank that he would come home on May 19th. He didn't come back, so she gave him all through the night to come back. Morning of May 20th, she decided that she needed to go look for him. and I jumped a little bit ahead, but. Okay, so this is the Model 76 Winchester that Mason would have had. Not this one, but this is what the gun looked like. So I thought it'd be real cool to try to find the history of Mason's rifle. I struck out, but I did find an article in October of 1888 in a Sundance paper. So elections were that fall, and so a bunch of the individuals running for offices gathered on Rocky Ford. So this is east of Sundance, towards the Aladdin turnoff out in there. So a guy named Henry Aiken had a ranch, and they had some sport shooting going on there where you could shoot a bunch of different things, and the best shot would win a Model 76 .40-60 caliber rifle. So I've not been able to find any other mentions of that caliber of the Winchester 76 other than somebody won that rifle at the shootout on Aiken's Ranch in 1888. So Mason's reputation was as a crack shot. So I haven't eliminated that this may be the event where Mason picked up his Winchester. So I thought that was pretty cool. This is the spot where Mason was killed. There's a cairn here, had a marker put there by Fawcett indicating that this was where they found Mason's body. Okay, so here's Hannah on her sawmill at the Mason home, the bear attack. She had to go up this way looking for Hank, found him dead, went all the way back to the sawmill, regained her senses, and at that point she had to go get help. So she went down Stockade Beaver Creek to the home of Riley Cochlisher. So this Cochlisher place was probably about a mile south of where Mason's home was. So she stopped there, and a gal named Sarah Cochlisher was home alone with two small kids. Her husband Riley was on the Friel Ranch handling some business there. So Hannah stopped there to get some help, got turned down by Sarah because she couldn't leave two little babies to go help Hannah. Kept going down Stockade to the EVA ranch, found a gentleman there named Jack Higgy that was planting potatoes. He supposedly blew her off and says he had no time to help her because he's planting potatoes. Kept going down the creek where he went to the Frank B. Fawcett Ranch and finally got some help from the Fawcetts. Okay, again, Frank Jr. was 10 years old and was around when Hannah came down Beaver Creek looking for help. Told his dad, Frank B., what had happened to Mason. They gathered a wagon full of people, including Hannah, went all the way up the creek, up into Bear Canyon where they found Mason's body.
What kind of mileage are you looking at there from?
I figured
15?
I think 7 or so.
Oh, okay.
But, I mean, and Hannah would have gone, 2
There
plus
and
there,
back,
2
yeah.
plus back, and 7 here.
Right,
All in one morning, finding your husband eaten.
walking.
Yep.
Was she horseback?
She walked. She was on foot this whole time. They didn't have a
My
horse at that
gosh.
point. I think they sold them all, and they just had some ox. So she did that all on foot, which is a story in itself to think of that walk.
Yeah.
Well, it's covered in the book, so there's a lot of stuff in here. So she found the help at Fawcett's. They took a wagon up, had to get Hank's body up there. They didn't know where the bear was, so they loaded him into the wagon and took him back to his cabin, put him in an extra room in his house to keep him at that point.
What was the time frame on that?
All in one morning this was all the morning of the 20th. So Hannah left early, got up there, got back, had some tea, went down to Fawcett's, got help. But they took that wagon up there and they were back by about noon. So most of Newcastle, and word had spread at that point what had happened. So you have a bear attack, even in 1893 was quite an event. So people started gathering at the ranch. They needed to figure out what to do next, mainly getting that bear. They dug Mason's grave there. They did bury him near his sawmill. And they assembled four hunters in the area that had one of which had dogs, good bear hunting dogs. So they went up to Bear Canyon, and these 4 guys ended up finding the bear and killing it.
Now I have a question. Was it named Bear Canyon and Bear Creek and all that before this?
And that's what's funny. Well, I talk about it in the book, but I'll tell you. So Bear Run was named Bear Run before all this happened. So for some reason, Bear Run outside EVA was known as Bear Run in 1890. Okay, Bear Canyon was not called Bear Canyon. From what I've found, it was called Tourmaline Canyon based upon Mason's gold patents. His claims referred to him on tourmaline. So that's a story in itself, because there's really no tourmaline. It's found more towards Custer and up in the granites, but they were calling it tourmaline for some reason, which leaves more speculation, mystery behind their whole big gold thing. So tourmaline's not found there, but neither is gold. But anyway, it was called tourmaline. 30 guys in all ended up going up Bear Canyon to bring the bear out. Okay, so the bear was dragged out by 30 men on a cowhide, loaded in that wagon, and taken into Newcastle. So shortly after the attack, this was in some point in June, maybe tail end of May, but a guy named A.M. Nelson in Newcastle was the postmaster. He sent a telegram to New York to Hank's sister named Emily Fremantle. So probably that would have been one of the relatives that Hannah had been aware of, was Hank's older sister Emily. So Emily did receive a telegram, responded to it on June 8th, and it got back to Newcastle. This says 1895, but this was transcribed by somebody else, so I suspect, that would have been a 2-year delay on that. So that's likely 1893. So a couple days later, Nelson responded to the telegram from Emily Fremantle talking about Hank being killed. Meanwhile, the bear got stuffed when he was taken into Newcastle. So this is the only photo that is known of the bear that killed Mason. So you got to remember, in the spring, the bear is not in very prime shape. It's coming off of hibernation, probably had a lot of shrinkage and lost a lot of weight. Growly, obviously. So this was the bear. Indications are 500 to 700 pounds, maybe. They've assumed that in the fall, when it would have been nice and fat, going into hibernation, it could have been around 1,000 pounds. The frame was that big. The teeth, claws, all that were just huge.
So who killed the bear?
Those 4 guys
Oh,
that went hunting for him.
oh,
Okay, so it went to a butcher named J.W. Smith. So Smith's Butcher was it's like where Perkins Tavern is now. That was the A.M. Nichols building, it was called at one point. So there used to be some businesses in there, one including Smith's Butcher Shop. So that's where the bear came up at first. Of course, a lot of people ate bear meat then. So the bear itself got eaten. The skull was kept by Smith, and the mounted bear itself went into a store owned by the Mollrings. So it was kind of like the equivalent of like a Sears type of a thing. So they carried a lot of items. But Mollrings had the bear in that store for a while, and it also ended up going to what was called the Rounds Gallery. So a guy named Rounds had a photography gallery that he opened up. Came from Sundance, opened that. So in that photo gallery, you could pose with the bear. So here you had the mad bear, and these 3, one of these was a Mollring. This was Dick Nelson. So Dick was an early resident of Newcastle and wrote quite a few books and stuff. So this is Dick, and this was Dick Nelson's photo. And this is another gentleman. So this was supposed to be Mason, and these were a couple of the bear killers. So
Michael Stolken did things right. And what Nathan Todd did in that meeting, dressing him down, he said not to pick sides. No, he did pick sides. And he picked Becky Hadlock's side. And once again, Becky Hadlock was wrong. So thank you on behalf of the people of Weston County to Michael Stolken for stepping up and doing the job that the people elect him to do.
Well, and not only was she wrong, but once we finally got our records request, she was even more wrong because it was incomplete. And the state public records ombudsman admitted that and said that those documents should have been included. So I just find it interesting that everybody puts faith in someone who continues to make the same mistakes, which at this point aren't mistakes.
Dick, and this was Dick Nelson's photo, and this was another gentleman. So this was supposed to be Mason, and these were a couple of the bear killers. So anyhow, that's the photo of the bear
Gotcha.
that
Killed
lives.
Mason.
The photo was found at the State Archives in Cheyenne. I got permission from them and decided it was as good as anything to use on my cover of the book, since I didn't have a photo of Hank. So the bear ended up going to Alliance, tail into 1890s. From there, it went to the World's Fair in 1903, 1904. So the theme of the World's Fair is in St. Louis was like the teddy bear. When you think of the teddy bear, that was when it was introduced, was at the 1904 World's Fair. So there's a big bear theme. So state of Nebraska, having the bear, this was one of the items that they took to the World's Fair. So our bear went to St. Louis, hung out at the World's Fair, came back. J.W. Smith at that time, related to these mole rings. Smith moved to Riverton and took the bear with him. The bear went in. You know, you're gonna not hear that story. You're gonna have to read book. So I found out what happened to the bear. So you're gonna have to read
the book.
for it yourself. So okay. Okay, so I call this Twilight on Beaver Creek. So this is post Hank dying. This is Hannah all alone on the Mason sawmill. Sawmill got repoed at that point. So all the equipment Hanson took back. Hank owed over $1,000 to Hanson at that point, which in 1893 is a substantial amount. So Hanson took the sawmill, moved it back up to Sundance. So Hannah was all alone. So this is called a tract book. These are found on the General Land Office, so that's part of the Department of the Interior. This is how you find early homestead records, so they were all in here. I looked for this section, Township and Range up Stockade, and here's Hank's patent for where his sawmill was on Stockade. So he filed for it in 1889. So this was another big indicator of when exactly did Mason come back down to Weston County, and that was in this date based upon his homestead information with that dating itself. One of the interesting thing is when I initially tried to find this homestead using the General Land Office records, because you could just put in anybody's name, and if they got a patent, you could find it. Well, I typed in him for Weston County and nothing. So that told me he didn't have a true homestead on Stockade Beaver Creek, and I thought, well, that doesn't mesh with the story. So again, this is one of my $50 deals where I had to, you find the homestead application number here, 270. I ordered it from the National Archives. I found what happened. So it was canceled by relinquishment in 1895. So 3 years after he was killed, and granted the 5 years of proving up on it was already passed. Okay, he would have filed in 1889, which would have been 1894. In theory, he could have paid $1.25 per acre and gotten his 160-acre homestead. Instead, with Hank dead, Hannah sat on it until July of 1895, and she decided that she would relinquish the homestead, so that essentially I give up all my rights to it, somebody else can. So this is the document. Here's Hannah's signature. So this talks about her giving back the homestead to the federal government. And this was typed up in her file too. So this talks about Hank getting killed by the bear, them getting married on Thanksgiving Day, 1892. She had a Robert Smith and J.L. Baird were her witnesses on this. With Baird kind of a mogul downtown in Newcastle, I suspect she owed money to Baird. And so that was probably part of how she got Baird to co-sign this relinquishment. Funny thing about Hannah on this is the day she relinquished it, she sold it to a family named Griggs. So Nathan Griggs was out of Beatrice, Nebraska, and he was the attorney for Kilpatrick Brothers in Collins. So there was a house on the land, a barn, so there was fencing. So Hank did make improvements to the land, so there was something of value there. Even though she didn't own the land, she owned the assets or the infrastructure. So that's what she sold to the Griggses and relinquished the land. And that same day she relinquished, Griggses applied for a homestead patent on it. And they picked up Hank's what was left of the house and the barn and all that, so.
Wow.
So this is early, probably about a 1905 photo. This was a Mary Capps photo, and I believe this was the Schultz Ranch. They called it in Beaver Creek Canyon. That was all the indications on that photo. Okay, so this is the site now. Mason Sawmill was right here. There's a pile of lumber right here, which is this building. Probably just looking at what I gathered from the photo, this barn and this house, probably same vintage, looking at the siding of the house. This, along with this big house, looks similar lumber, so I'm assuming these were built by Griggs after the purchase from Mason, and this would have been Mason barn. Probably the Mason house would have just been one of these, and something was added on by Griggs. They did say they had a milk house, I think, or milk barns, so I think they ended up converting Mason's house into a different barn, so that was pretty cool to see. So 10 years after Mason had this land, this photo was taken, and there it is today.
Where exactly is that? Where exactly is that?
Oh, towards Mallow. Around Parmalee, kind of that vicinity. Okay, so guardians of the story. We've talked about Big Frank Jr. retelling the story, passed on by his dad, Frank B. So this is a copy of the letter. So Frank B. helped kill the bear, help haul Hank out, help bury him, all that. So First Fawcett documented things pretty well, and it was found in this letter that Frank wrote. Okay, so this is a pretty solid description of what happened to Hank and what the men found when they went up the canyon with Hannah and the events that followed. Probably, again, the basis of the 1959 article that Frank Jr. wrote was obviously retelling by his dad. So this is found at the Anna Miller Museum.
Cool.
So
That is
this
so
guy wants to
cool.
read the letter. This is the first account of the killing of Mason outside of
man.
contemporary
Is that in this
newspaper
book?
accounts. What's that?
Is that in your book?
No,
It's at the museum though.
I was afraid of it wasn't gonna copy over well.
That is so cool.
You can go to the museum and make.
So now is Frank Fawcett, or do you know, I mean, is that Mary Capps's?
No relation.
No relation?
No.
Oh.
So here's Frank B. I have a whole chapter written on the Fawcetts. It's pretty interesting. So Frank B. served with Custer before Custer decided he would go to Montana and all that business. He was in Oklahoma, Kansas, that area, and Frank B. Fawcett was stationed with General Custer on some of his earlier campaigns. So that's kind of cool. Frank Jr. would boast that he probably was the last survivor that could say their dad served with Custer, because Frank was 97, I think, when he died in 79. So. Okay, so by the 1930s, Mason's grave wasn't marked. So the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, they had a lot of projects going on at that time to recognize graves and various things like that. So this is a chunk of local sandstone. Okay, so the DAR had Mason's headstone carved and placed upon his grave.
Killed by bear. Mason killed by bear.
So this is in about 1935 too. The DAR had a whole recognition up at Stockade Beaver Creek. Okay, so here's my chain that you saw me posing with. These chains been pulled, posts have been pulled, but these posts are still laying out in the grass. Okay, so there's the posts. Does anybody know who this is? Probably not yet. But this is Fred Coates. Okay, and this is C.P. Meek was his name around the Upton area. He was a rancher and a senator So Meek and Fred Coates came to the Mason recognition. Coates had a long history with Hank Mason beginning in the early 1880s, both involved with the whole Tom Wagner situation. Coates played a huge role in that. So that's a book in itself talking about Fred Coates and his involvement with Tom Wagner and even Mason to that extent. So another thing that I wanted to kind of clear up on all my research was the whole thing on Hank Mason's mother-in-law being buried up on rawhouses. Okay, so that started around 1980 or so, that she didn't like the canyon, it was too cold and all that business, so when she died, she wanted to be buried out of the canyon. Okay, that was kind of the story that was told, and I thought, well, that makes no sense, because, I knew Hannah's mom had died in 1859 in Iowa, so that'd be Hank Mason's mother-in-law in theory. So that's not, and they were calling her Mrs. Cochlisher, which we now know who Cochlishers are. They're Mason's closest neighbors, so that made no sense too. Cochlishers were recent arrivals to Beaver Creek in like 1890 or 91. Okay, this grave was placed around 1889 or 1888, so probably way before Mason was even married. So I wanted to look more into this whole mysterious grave on Rawhauser. So I went with Jan Farella and got a hold of Rawhausers, and Rawhausers knew exactly where this grave was and took us to there. I cleaned it off and all that, and it says Mrs. Gudslinger. So that headstone is in two pieces. It's just out in the middle of nowhere. And so I looked up Gudslinger. What the heck kind of name is that? I cannot find that name even being a name in existence. So I suspect it was somebody there that maybe just randomly said Gussinger or Gusinger or something like that, and they just phonetically tried to spell it, and they had Gudslinger. That's all I can figure out. There's a little cross writing here on the rock, so they did put a lot of work into it. Being located almost right on the Cheyenne Deadwood Trail, it's probably was some traveler at some point, either on during the stagecoach days, or that road was still used to get to Sundance. So who knows who could have died on the old trail, and they just buried her there. So that's the Mrs. Cochlisher, Hank Mason's mother-in-law, theory debunked. I talk about that a little bit in the book, but okay, so this is a cool painting. I'm sure most people have seen it. It's in the library, right?
Who's the painter?
So this guy that painted this is Dick Terry.
Yeah.
So Dick did this approaching the 1990 Wyoming Centennial. He did this painting in. There's
That's
Hank Mason.
cool.
Is it Doug Krogman?
Yeah.
No. Oh.
Oh.
I couldn't remember. Oh no, Doug Carter, right? So that's Doug Carter, and this is Bernie. So who's the bear?
Bernie was the bear, but
Okay. So Doug Carter's a Sundance guy. He's Caleb Carter, who lives in Newcastle's uncle. So he's known Dick for a long time. So anyway, I think Doug was the guy in the tree, and Bernie poses as the bear. So anyway, that's a cool painting, and
I love the detail of the Winchester on the ground that he had to drop it to climb.
Exactly. So I was
Great.
Thank Dick again for letting me use this painting in the book. So it is in my book.
It's not an aspen tree.
You said that, Mark?
No, it
So
isn't.
that's what kept it from going on the cover. And Dick was aware of that, and and all that, but that's a moot point. But yeah, he should have been climbing a Ponderosa. Other than maybe one of the problems with them in there was a lot of these branches, at least now, they're high up. These Ponderosas,
Yeah, how'd you
and
get there
how
even?
many low-hanging branches could have been available at the spur of the moment. You'd have had aspen that had something you can grab onto versus a Ponderosa. So I'd have been climbing a Ponderosa, maybe still up there sitting in that thing, but we should have lived. Okay, so this is in the book too. So we went up to the grave on May 19th, 2024. And so my daughter Alice, this is her contribution to Hank. So she wanted to draw Hank's grave with his headstone. So that's in the book. So then my son Peter and I hiked up Bear Canyon last year. And so this is the spot where Hank died. So the cairn's placed there in the 1930s by both Frank Fawcett's. Okay, before I get into questions, we're going to talk about some other things. So these are some current and upcoming books. Okay, there's that book. If anybody in the room doesn't have it, I've got some for sale. So that was my first book. I published it a year ago today.
Oh, really?
And Hank's officially published today too. So somehow timing put it 1 year apart exactly.
Wow.
So May 9th of last year was when Slim was released. The other neat thing that just happened on my Slim book is it was turned into a podcast on a series called Dead and Gone in Wyoming. So I wasn't really into podcasts until a friend showed me this last year, and I thought, man, this is the best podcast in Wyoming. And so I got, you listen to it, I almost guarantee it. I haven't found a better one. And so I approached the guy last year and said, can I mail you a book? I got a heck of a story for you. So I mailed him a free copy of Slim, and then I finally heard back from him, and he talks about it on the podcast, is apologizing for his delinquency on finally opening the package, but he did, and he couldn't put it down. So it is available on a podcast now. A guy named Scott Fuller does a pretty good job on it. He did screw up a couple things, which, of course, being the author, knowing the story, upside and down when I hear something that's not right, it just kind of throws the whole thing out of whack. But besides a couple date, and he said Wyoming Territory instead of Wyoming, but just piddly things like that. It was a pretty good, so I'm pretty tickled to have this available on podcast. So this is available for free on Apple. You don't have to have a login or anything. You just go on there and listen to it. So if you haven't heard it, I'd encourage you to, because it's kind of neat.
He always stresses you have to buy a book to hear the rest of the story.
Yeah.
You don't tell the whole thing. That was great.
Okay, so this book, so I dropped Hank for a couple months to do Slim, picked Hank back up. Then I got on this kick on this book, and I thought, well, I just need to get this one out before Hank, and then I thought, I need to get Hank wrapped up. Okay, so this one's about done. I may hang on to it till May 9th of next year, or March 9th of next year. We'll just see. I'm not sure I want 2 in a year. But I'm calling this one The Outlaws of Red Butte. Title's kind of still in the works, but it's Sundance Kid and the Shooting of Buck Hamby. So it happened in this area, like really close to Newcastle. Like should be another Newcastle story. So I'm got some stuff here I'm confident nobody knows. I'm the only one on the planet. So when you have something that good, you need to share it. So this book should be coming out. I'm pretty excited about this. It's going to be kind of short. The Hank book got pretty long. I needed to cover everything to tell the whole story. Because Hank's story, I feel, is our story. Because it deals with so many stories that we know, and some of our relatives of people that were here for a long time can pick up these names. And so it's kind of all ties in together with who we are as a town and a county. So that's the thing with Hank. This book, quite a bit shorter, but it has early Newcastle history too. And again, I'm pretty excited about it because I found some real neat stuff. So podcast worthy maybe. Okay, and this is another book that's about done. So this is, I've called it, I think, Doorstep of Invasion, the murder of Thomas Jefferson Wagner. So this is the story of Tom Wagner. This was a Dave Pauly drawing that Dave did for Mabel in the 1860s or 1960s. Okay, so he commissioned this, or she commissioned it for Bits and Pieces magazine. So it wasn't done anywhere else other than Mabel. I can't find the original, but I got a hold of the Pauly family in Upton and received permission to use a Dave Pauly on my book.
How cool is that? That's
Yeah.
neat.
So that's pretty cool. So this is Tom Wagner, this guy here, and the three masked men that took him from his house. So I won't go into that story. You'll get the gist of it in Hank. But so that's going to be after the Sundance Kid book. Okay, so that wraps it up.
Oh, Lucas.
The story about Red Rooster.